Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. Ahmad Chalabi is dead at the age of 71 of a heart attack in Iraq. He was a former Iraqi politician who was very close to the CIA, the Project for the New American Century, who was also Bush administration officials such as Dick Cheney and Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. Chalabi is seen as the key source for claims that were used to justify the invasion of Iraq, such as intelligence that linked Saddam Hussein to be in possession of weapons of mass destruction. That was then proven to be incorrect. And also he reported to U.S. officials that Saddam Hussein was maintaining ties with al-Qaeda. Now joining me to discuss all of this is Patrick Cockburn. Patrick is a correspondent for The Independent. He was awarded Foreign Reporter of the Year at the 2015 Press Awards. He is the author of The Rise of the Islamic State, ISIS, and the New Sunni Revolution. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Patrick, let's begin with the man himself. Who was Ahmad Chalabi?
Well, I knew him very well over the last 25 years. He was an extraordinary figure, and not a person who was much understood inside or outside Iraq. He was very driven, very relentless, very determined to get rid of Saddam Hussein. But he was never keen on Iraq being occupied. He thought the only way of getting rid of Saddam was to have the U.S. invade. But once the U.S. had done that, he wanted the U.S. out. That's why he was so much in favor in Washington before 2003. And a year later, they were sending around troops to possibly to arrest him, certainly to take stuff from his house. So I think he was kind of misunderstood because it was said that he'd passed on information about Saddam having weapons of mass destruction. Certainly he put journalists and politicians in the way of finding that. But he became a bit of a scapegoat for this. He wanted to get rid of Saddam. He passed this on. So did most of the Iraqi opposition at that time. But it was extraordinarily naive of journalists to just take his word for it because he was partisan. He was trying to get rid of Saddam. So it's no excuse for just running these stories without bothering to check them.
So there are various groups that indicate and sometimes says they have evidence that that Chalabi's group, Iraqi National Congress, got more than $100 million from the CIA and other agencies between various U.S. funding sources to fund the opposition against Saddam Hussein and for him to get into power. Is there any truth to that?
Oh, I think so, yes. I mean, these anti-Saddam organizations are looking and finding money from the CIA and the U.S. But Chalabi didn't get on for time to go on with the CIA, but gradually they got sidelined by him from about the mid-90s. I think partly because they couldn't control him. Chalabi was a very clever guy, but he used people, he used organizations to try and achieve his ends. He was very relentless. And so when he used them, he was much disliked by the CIA, by the State Department. But he was a lot better than the other people whom they eventually chose to cooperate with, who said whatever they thought these agencies wanted to hear, and were pretty useless. Chalabi was pretty effective. And I think at the end of the day, an Iraqi nationalist. He was an amazing array of enemies. Saddam Hussein, he was always on Iraqi television in Saddam's time as the typical Iraqi exiled opposition, multi-millionaire. Actually, Chalabi wasn't a multi-millionaire, but as a multi-millionaire living on the fat of the land, paid for by the CIA and other intelligence agencies. And that kind of stuck within Iraq. Then abroad, he had friends, but he also had a lot of enemies. But I think this sort of demonization was very much exaggerated. As I said, it was really absurd for journalists to say, this Iraqi opposition guy gave me some information which is damaging to Saddam, and then just put it on the front page of the New York Times. I mean, how old are you? This is all this information was partisan and was bound to be. So I think all this ex post facto about how we were lured into war by Saddam Hussein, it's pretty silly. First of all, the U.S. wouldn't have invaded Iraq if it hadn't been for 9/11. They weren't going to do that. But it depends. You have to assume an incredible naivete that they believed everything that Saddam was saying.
Now, this coverage in the mainstream press that gives Chalabi's this kind of role that he played prior to the invasion of Iraq and alleging that he misinformed the CIA and of course the Bush administration, all give some pass in terms of investigative journalism or to the mainstream media for all the war hype prior to the Iraq War. Do you think that the mainstream press here is given a pass here as a result of this allegation?
Oh yeah, they kind of used him as a blame. You had articles appearing, which, if you knew something about Iraq, were just obvious nonsense in the New Yorker on the front page of the New York Times. It was a very low point in American journalism that this stuff was being published. As subsequently admitted, I think that the New York Times about a year later had an investigation into its own journalism. Its own public editor wrote a long letter explaining what had gone wrong and why they'd done it. But it was pretty shameful stuff. Then they sort of blamed Chalabi, the intelligence agency. But, these weren't naive people. What did they think they were doing when, Chalabi afterwards said, well, I was trying to overthrow Saddam Hussein. I passed on this information. So, I think this is pretty understandable. I mean, I was, often got told stories like that at that time by Iraqi opposition. And, I discount about 2/3 of them as being fabrications. So I think that putting all the blame on Chalabi is very naive and actually very culpable.
And how much of a link is there between the American oil industry and Chalabi? Now, there's a big connection between the Bush administration and the oil industry, and Iraq being one of the biggest producers. Is there a link between these three sources, Chalabi, the Bush administration, and the oil industry?
I don't think there was much of a direct link. But I think in general terms, look, we all know that Iraq was the world's big producer of, cabbages and nothing else. But the rest of the world, including the United States, wouldn't be that interested in what happened there. But the fact that oil did make a difference. Were the oil companies thinking, aha, we'll get that concession if we get rid of Saddam? I'm not sure they did. I think there was a general feeling that it mattered who controlled Iraq. But it wasn't sort of specific oil companies saying get rid of Saddam and get into Iraq and make a bomb.
Right. And one of the reasons that Chalabi was hobnobbing with the conservatives in the United States is because he was actually poised to be the leader of Iraq once Saddam Hussein fell. Why didn't he become the leader?
He was never that popular among Iraqis who saw him, he was kind of spent most of his life outside Iraq. He never had much of a popular following there. He got elected to parliament, but didn't have much of a popular following. And he'd been kind of demonized by Saddam before, so people were distrustful of him. And that never quite took off. Also, in the early days, things were kind of run by the U.S., and they didn't trust him. I think part of the thing, controlling But when you look at the people they did trust, Chalabi looked kind of good news compared to these other fellows, you know, who were completely incompetent and stole everything that wasn't nailed down.
All right, Patrick, I thank you so much for joining us on such a late hour for you.
Not at all. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.